All right, everybody can hear me? Okay. Welcome to our Thoroughbred Aftercare Summit. This year, we're doing it a bit differently. If you've attended a previous summit, this is going to be a scenario preparedness workshop. And we mean workshop in that you guys are going to participate. That's why you have your worksheets in front of you and pens, and the map of a farm will be for our second scenario. So first, we're just going to have kind of our subject matter experts give their introductions and tell you a bit about the key things that they think you should know in case any of it is new to you. So first, we're going to have Kelly speak to natural disaster preparedness and her very unique experience with it.
Hello. So hi, everybody. My name is Kelly. I'm co-founder of Caribbean Thoroughbred Aftercare in Puerto Rico. I have been through 2 Cat 5 hurricanes with horses in the islands. And I think seeing the recent hurricane that actually went through Florida, it was Ian, was it? Hurricane Ian. That one didn't hit us, that went south of us, but I was kind of shocked how many people left their horses in barns. And seeing as Florida is very flat, we're quite mountainous in Puerto Rico, but I know that there was a lot of horses standing in water and stranded in Florida. So I just wanted to give a few examples of situations that have happened in the islands. My suggestion is, if you are in hurricane path, don't leave your horses in a barn if you are in low ground areas, because remember, if the barns flood, then they can't get out. If the barns fall down, they're going to fall down on top of the horses. I don't really know what the structures are like in the United States. I've never lived here, but I know most of our barns in Puerto Rico, like my barn is pretty put together with just wood donated. So if we had a really bad Cat 5 hurricane, I would not leave my horses in our barn because it would fall. In Hurricane Maria, which was back in 2017, it was a Cat 5 and our roof went. Luckily, the barn didn't collapse, but we just let the horses out because that way they can fend for themselves. You do always have a problem with debris, with trees and from shelters could fly, but you'd be surprised that the horses tend to. I remember in Hurricane Maria, I was looking out the window at the horses and I could see them. They all just kind of huddled together and protected each other. Always have a generator. If you're in the path of a hurricane, you should have a generator as a backup. We did not have a generator in Hurricane Maria. Luckily, the disaster efforts that came in afterwards, who were the first people that helped us with TCA, Aaron, and they sent a container which had, I think, 24 generators in it. So we ended up using that generator because we didn't have water either to run our pump. And because we didn't have the generator, well, we couldn't run the pump either. So Hurricane Maria really opened our eyes. So this last hurricane that went through, Fiona, we did not get the brunt of the hurricane because we were on the northeast side of the island, but we were totally set. I mean, we had generator, we had water, we had places to move the horses to. The farm flooded in the back, but the water went down the next day. And always have supplies on hand or have some type of I mean, it's a lot different where we are compared to you guys, because you guys can just kind of move. If you're in a hurricane, we can't move, we can't go anywhere. So I mean, we would always think to move our horses higher land. I mean, we're kind of at the base of the rainforest, and then we're like 5 minutes from the beach. So, I mean, if a tsunami came, definitely, I mean, the horses would need to be moved higher up. But flooding where we are is not a big problem. It's mostly the winds. If it's a Category 5, a Cat 4 hurricane, because it will pretty much blow everything down. questions, like, I mean, with supplies, like I said, we have a good relationship with our racetrack and the clinic. They have a big storage area where they keep all extra fluids, medications, antibiotics, anything like that. We have a couple of vets that can shoot the horses if necessary to euthanize them, and have permission from our local police to do so. And questions? Yes? Yeah, for this last hurricane that we had just a few weeks ago, we did communicate a lot with different farm owners and stable owners, just telling them, you know, depending on where they were on the island, to identify their horses. Because we're on an island, it's very contained. Sometimes we're lucky that way compared to the United States, because if horses do get out and about or whatever, we can usually figure out who they are. Most of the horses, any horses that come into Puerto Rico, have to be microchipped. So, and the USDA now is actually trying to make it so any horses, whether they're Paso Finos, quarter horses, everybody have a microchip. So that way we can just scan them and see who they are. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people did, they would paint on their butts or put braids and telephone numbers in their hair and stuff like that. We did have a couple of years ago, quite a few earthquakes, but they weren't that bad. That they were more on the south side of the island, along the towns that were on the beach, and they affected those, but not really any of the farms where they were. Recently, the Hurricane Fiona, the problem we're having right now, which we did a hay fund for, was because it came through the southwest side of the island, where all our hay farms were. And so they got completely taken out and flooded. So we have basically no hay production for the next 2 months. So we did a hay fund to bring in 2 containers, which is really not enough. It's only 1,400 bales of hay. And we're basically, we're going to get the first container next week. We're going to be doing distribution just for thoroughbreds. And then we're going to do a second container, which is going to be for other breeds in need, but it's probably not going to be enough. So I'm not quite sure how long it's going to be before the hay gets up and running. But you have to think about that also. One thing I found in Hurricane Maria, the racetrack got completely taken out. I mean, all the roofs were gone, and we had 1,400 horses on the track at the time. And it was kind of amazing because no horses died during the hurricane. It was the aftermath, because they were standing in water for days. They had no feed. Most employees couldn't get to the barns, couldn't get to the track, because they lived in different parts of the island and nobody could get out anywhere. And so basically horses are just standing with days with no water. They were drinking contaminated water. The people that were at the track were giving them wet feed, and so they would colic. We had no hay. I mean, there was just nothing. So when the first container came in with the generators, we had a lot of alfalfa pellets, which we were rationing. So I think also that's another thing, that with this hurricane, the track was much more prepared at the time, because I had the Racing Commission put out a press release stating that everybody needs to put their feed up, their hay up, so it doesn't get wet in a dry place that's secure, because most of the barns have are cement at the racetrack. And so they did. So this time it was way better than the first time. So I think everybody was much more prepared. But it is tough because, I mean, with us being on an island, I mean, the ports get closed down. You can't get anything in, you can't get anything out. There's just nowhere to go. So, I mean, I remember in Hurricane Maria, all the owners started sending their horses to the breeding farms, but the breeding farms didn't have enough feed for all those horses. So, I mean, hundreds of horses starved to death. So it's just, yeah, it's a difficult, if you're in a hurricane path, have a generator, have water tanks. Most places in the US, they have wells or for water, or how does that work here?
I'd say it's a mix on farms
Okay.
between city or well.
Is city water expensive? Or it depends where you are.
I was like, it depends a little
think-
where you are, but not too terrible.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, a few of the bigger farms, they have their own wells. We don't have a well, we have city water, but we do have a river in the back that if we have the generator, we can run the pump to pump water up to the barn. So. Yes, we do. Yep. So I can get your email and I can, if anybody wants our emergency plan, I can email it to you. Yeah, yeah.
And everyone who signed up and participates in the summit will send out a resource list, and we can include that in the resources that we send out of some further different places to look for more information. Next, we have Dr. Barr, and she's going to speak a bit about biosecurity, looking at, you know, as we all work with thoroughbreds and them coming off of the track, the different concerns we have there.
Hello, thank you. I have actually just a little PowerPoint presentation. So I was kind of tasked with just talking about the importance of having an established biosecurity protocol and some best horse health practices. And that's a hard thing to do in about 10 minutes. So I'm doing my best with kind of just giving an overview of things. So just to give you a little background about myself, I am from Western Pennsylvania, and then I moved down to Kentucky when I started working at Rood and Riddle Equine Hospital. I'm a veterinarian. I went to school at the University of Pennsylvania, and then actually I've specialized in internal medicine. So I went on and did some extra education, a residency, and I'm board certified in internal medicine. And so my job at the clinic, I see a lot of more sick babies and respiratory cases, but I also am in charge of our infectious disease control program, or our biosecurity control program at the clinic. I'm married, and my husband and I have a 90-acre farm in Bourbon County where we raise some thoroughbreds. And yeah, I guess that's about it. But like I said, I just wanted to give you just a little background on myself. So whenever I talk about biosecurity, I just kind of always like to educate my audience as to, it's hard. Everybody's kind of over here. Can everybody see the screen or not? Okay. All right. I'm going to kind of look at the screen a little bit, so I'm not turning my back to you guys. But anyway, so biosecurity are those practices intended to prevent the introduction and spread of infectious diseases within a group of horses. Actually, on a broader base, I mean, you can imply that into prevent the spread of infectious disease to any group of animals and even people. I mean, I think when I used to start talking about biosecurity to groups of people was about 15 years ago, but talking to people these days, it's a lot easier because we've all lived through the pandemic. So we always understand biosecurity a little bit better these days. And at least I use that term, and I think a lot of people use that term biosecurity interchangeably with infection control or infection disease control. So bottom line is biosecurity is just prevention. It's the simple routine. It's the day-to-day practices which we can do that can guard your horse's health against a fatally it's against a fatal disease. And it's important that every concept or every different step or every place you're dealing with horses. My biggest, I deal with it at a hospital setting, but there's events such as these places at racetracks and on the farm level. So you deal with it at every different level when you're dealing with a horse operation. So why is biosecurity so important? The stuff on the right-hand side of the screen is just various headlines that have been taken out of, various news sources. Equine vesicular stomatitis confirmed in Wyoming, outbreak of equine herpes virus, 7 horses dead, leptospirosis, and even just antibiotic resistant, bacteria found in a hospital population or something like that. So, I mean, these things, these infectious diseases make headlines. So I think we all are here to do what's best for the horse. And with biosecurity, that's what we have to strive to do. What is best for the horse? And also what is best for people. We think about infectious diseases. We think about those things probably like herpes, strangles, leptospirosis, those things. But there are some of these diseases that actually can affect people, from an infection disease control standpoint. We can have an effect on antibiotic resistance. So, antibiotic resistant bacteria can affect people, they can affect horses. So just kind of looking at it the broader, where biosecurity is so important just to protect our horses, yeah, but also can protect those people, that are working for us or even that are on our farm. The effects of an outbreak can be devastating. So the death of horses or the debilitating diseases or debilitating conditions that could be short-term or it could be long-term for the animal. Quarantine. Many of these diseases are reportable. And so your facility may be quarantined for, an extended period of time. Some of those quarantines vary from state to state. But, there are some diseases that every state, you're going to have a veterinary official coming and chatting with you and, quarantining the in and outs, the daily activities of what's happening at your place. Also public perception. So, some poor PR, when you have had an outbreak at your farm, your facility, people are going to remember that. And especially with all the social media and everything, you're going to get some bad publicity. And then the cost, it can be very, very, very costly. Just roughly, from a veterinary hospital standpoint, years ago, probably like 10, 12 years ago, one of the veterinary hospitals had an outbreak of salmonella at their facility. And by the time it was all said and done, they added up all the costs, and it probably cost them over a couple $1 million. So it can be very, very, very costly. So when I think, I'm a very simple-minded person, I like to kind of keep things simple as I'm doing things, whether it's about biosecurity or even, managing a sick patient. So when I think of specific aspects of biosecurity, at least especially on the farm level, and I think this probably could happen at every equine operation, but you want to prevent the entry of an infectious disease. That's number one. And then secondary, you want to control the spread should it unfortunately enter. And these two topics, I could probably talk for an hour or two, and I probably only have 5 more minutes to talk. So we're going to just kind of talk just some general things very, very briefly. So overall, the first point, prevent entry. This is where you want to optimize the health of the horse. So this is where it's very, very important, just the overall general health of the horse. You want to make sure the horse is well vaccinated. So, whatever. And this, I always deferred to veterinarians that are managing the farm. What is the best vaccines? If you look on the AEP's list of vaccinations, they have core-based vaccines and we have risk-based vaccines. And so, you know, I think that's a good place to start and a good place to start a discussion, you know, with your veterinarian. For sure, you want the horses to be vaccinated against influenza and herpes virus. But, you know, you also want to have, you know, tetanus and some of these other diseases covered. And again, I'm not going to get into that. You want to make sure that the horses have up-to-date coggins, and a lot, like I said, all these vaccines and stuff like that, you want to discuss with your veterinarian as to what is most appropriate for your situation. And then another important thing is optimize nutrition. Make sure the horses are getting the proper nutrition that they need. I mean, how can you stay healthy? You know, you need to eat, you need to exercise, proper deworming, and then just minimize stress. Those are very, very key important things when it comes to hopefully, you know, preventing entry of an infectious disease onto your property, and hopefully optimizing the horse's health so that you don't have to deal with an infectious disease. And then other important highlights, kind of topics or points to think about are just having a medical history of the individual when they come onto your farm, knowing what type of history, you know, what problems they've had in the past. And then I think this is very, very important, having a biosecurity plan in place. I think that's very, very important. And key elements to consider with a biosecurity plan would be isolation, quarantine, minimizing traffic control, segregating horses based on their health, their age, and their risk, just good hygiene in general, and then cleaning and disinfecting. And then very importantly, what are we going to do if somehow an infectious disease does get on our farm? How are we going to act? I'm the type of person that always likes to be prepared. So I think that is very, very important. So you want to have a plan, you want to have it outlined, and then you want to know if something gets on, how are we going to prevent it? And then how are we going to react when it does get on the farm? And then a very, very, very important thing too is just communication with all your employees, with all your clients that come onto the farm, with any visitors that come onto the farm. You know, everybody that comes on might not need to know all the details, but, you know, especially your employees, the people that are working there day to day, they need to know what you expect from them when it comes to infection disease control on your farm. And a lot, like at the clinic, I'll give you the example. What I do is I've got things posted. You see this, I guess it's red now, reddish color picture here. That is one of our protocols I have posted in the barns. You know, we've got 10 barns there. Sorry, I had to think about it. We have 10 barns there, and each barn houses a little bit of a different type of patient. And so to keep it straight, I've got these, I call them my biosecurity quick reference. So my staff, if they go into that barn and they're not sure what protocols they need to follow, they know where this is. They will go and look at it. And I also will confess, I use it too oftentimes because I've done my biosecurity. I've done this for 15 years, and it's a very fluid thing. It changes. And sometimes this old brain can't remember everything. So I will utilize those also. And then lastly, just be prepared. You know, what do we do? Again, if we are unfortunate enough to have some type of outbreak on our farm, you know, we want to have a plan of action. What are we going to test for? How are we going to quarantine, disinfect? What PPE do we need? What disinfectant do we need to use? You know, all those things. And that's where you need to involve your veterinarian as to what is going to be the best course of action if we have this problem. Or, hey, doc, I've got this horse that has this fever and it's doing this, and I'm concerned. What should we do? How do we test and you know, how do we kind of contain this? And I think that is all I have right now. Like I said, that was kind of a very quick overview, but I'm happy to answer any questions either now, during the little exercise, or even afterwards. Thanks.
There are a lot of organizations that would be more rescue oriented, where a horse might be coming into their facility where they have very limited or no knowledge of the horse's medical history. What would you suggest are like the basic protocols when you are taking a horse in that you do not have a history on?
I guess my thought would be is, and I know sometimes these places are getting a lot of horses at once. I guess I would say figure out the best way that I can take this horse. I can kind of isolate it from my more resident population and then monitor it. Temperature, attitude, is it eating well? And then ultimately, once you kind of feel like the horses, and I guess, some of these horses can come in pretty bad condition. And so if that's the case, then, you want to, optimize getting them eating, making sure they're eating, hopefully they're gaining weight, just kind of, triage them and be able to manage them that way. Eventually down the road, work on, potentially getting them vaccinated and everything. I think each individual is going to be different depending on how they come in body condition and health wise, just looking at them.
General guidelines for paddocks, if there's obviously airborne, like go out, you can set up your resident horse. And also like concrete stall block style or wood style, right? So I have a concrete block barn, there's no ventilation to install, so that might take the horse one next to another because it's solid concrete wall on all sides versus maybe it's not. It's kind of that airborne.
I think, some of it is going to depend on this scenario. And I will say, involving your veterinarian will be involved, but if it is one of those diseases where quarantine is involved and you got a state veterinarian coming in, I guess, and I'm spoiled because I'm in Kentucky and we've got a phenomenal state veterinarian and they're very, very helpful with these things. But anyways, I would say like paddocks, probably you want to at least have maybe, some of the airborne stuff, you need 30 feet. Some of them you need more like 120. So, I would kind of err on probably more than less to be able to quarantine. It's great to have a separate barn. As for those airborne, like if they're stalled, yeah, if you have, for the most part, you're going to be good if you have a concrete stall, walls that are the whole way up. Problem would get to be with ventilation for the animal. But usually, and the nice thing about the concrete too, is that you're able to clean and disinfect them versus wood and everything. So what I would say is depending on the horses affected or infected, I guess. And the other horses you have, if you can put the horses that have been exposed possibly in another barn and the other horses in a separate barn, that's probably your best case scenario. But yes, the walls that go the whole way up to the ceiling, concrete walls, even wood would probably be okay. The other option would be, is in some of these scenarios, is to stall a horse, leave the stall next to him empty, and then put the horse in the next stall. Did that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. Right. And I do remember too, also, you have to remember people too, hands and, and foam, other fomites too. So that's a big, that's a big part of it too. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. to optimize their health. I mean, I think the important thing is, I think vaccines, make sure they're proper immunization, sorry, health too, nutrition, make sure they're on a well-balanced diet. I mean, there are so many of those supplements out there, and I honestly can't say that I feel that one is better over another one, my thought would be is if you want to, give a supplement. I mean, I like the brands like that are, Platinum Performance, Kentucky Equine Research, those different things. I mean, I think you just know your horse and just, keep an eye on their temperature and everything. If it's an older horse, I think screening for diseases such as PPID, equine Cushing's, because that can really affect the horse's immune system, just things like that. When I figure out that drug that it helps the immune system, I'll give y'all free samples, and I'll be in Hawaii on the beach.
Thank you, Dr. Barr, and thank you, Kelly, for getting us started. Just missed the part where we introduced ourselves. So we're going to back it up a second. My name is Kirsten Green. I'm the Executive Director of Retired Racehorse Project, and this Aftercare Summit is a collaborative effort between us, Thoroughbred Charities of America, the Jockey Club Thoroughbred Incentive Program. We've got Aaron Hallowell and Kristen Werner with us, and also Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance. This is an aftercare summit, but it is inclusive of for-profit and nonprofit organizations and operations. A lot of the issues are very similar with, maybe a couple of different nuances, but a lot of the things that we're covering today are going to be applicable to both. With that said, we thought it would be nice to just go around the room if you wanted to throw up your hand and say which organization you're representing or the name of your farm or operation. It'd be great to get a sense of who's here with us today. You want to start with us? Is this thing on? Okay. Now we're on. Okay. There we go. Yes, as Kirsten mentioned, my name is Aaron Hallowell. I'm the Executive Director of Thoroughbred Charities of America. We are the title sponsor of the Thoroughbred Makeover. Looking forward to another amazing week here. I think this is our 10th year, maybe about that, as the title sponsor. So yeah, we're thrilled to be here.
So now we're going to get into our scenarios. So, we'll put up the prompts, and it's the same basically as what you have on your sheet to fill out your answers. We'll give you a couple of minutes. I know some of the tables have multiple organizations or farms, so you guys can confer. And if you want to put down your own answers, that's fine. If you want to have a table answer, that works too. We'll give you a chance to do that and kind of work through these different scenarios that are things that we all have faced or could face, I suppose. So our first scenario, you have a new horse that arrives at your facility coming in off of the racetrack. You do not get any vaccination history or prior health information. It does come from the track, so you are coming in with a health certificate and a current Coggins. But you don't have any other information, and it's coming on a load of horses that are not all coming to your facility, and you're not necessarily sure if they're all coming from the same spot at the track as well. And then for the sake of this, we'll say the horse has a body condition score of about a 4 and appears generally track fit and healthy. So when this horse comes to the farm, what do you do? What are your first protocols? How do you handle that horse in those first couple of days? Go ahead and take a few minutes. The farm map is for our next scenario. So this is based on your own property where you would be bringing the horse currently. Oh, that is. We have lots of notes written. Oh, absolutely. You can. We don't have to. Because I'm not great.
And I don't have anything
Jan
coming in.
does too. Jan gets horses off the track.
Fence, the back aisle, the faces away, that'll be my horse will be on that.
All right, has everybody had a chance to work through it, kind of think about what you would do? So, does anybody want to share what their first 24 hours with a horse coming off the track would look like? Say, does anyone want to volunteer for that or be voluntold? I mean, you did take the most notes. Okay, we're gonna make new vocation share because you have a large table with lots of opinions.
So typically when we get a horse in from the racetrack, we do keep them in one specific barn. We try not to move them around too much. We do not have a specific quarantine barn, but most of our horses do come with vaccination or health records. If they don't, we do monitor for, as long as needed, at least a week, if not two, and we wait about 2 weeks to vaccinate to make sure that they're all settled in and all of that fun stuff. If they spike a fever or anything like that, we don't hesitate to call our vet and, kind of go from there. But we have been overall very lucky.
Anybody on this side that wants to share or add?
I would just add to that, I'd call the trainer to see if maybe he just forgot to include the health papers, but has them, or call the shipping company and see if maybe the driver just left them in the truck, or ask why they're shipping horses without requiring basic paperwork.
Dr. Barr, based on our two scenarios, is there anything you would say they should do differently or draw attention to?
No, I mean, I think the very good protocol. I would assume you take the horse's temperature at least once or twice a day for at least 14 days. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that sounds good. I mean, I think too, and I know some of the things that I'm probably going to say may not be realistic because, it has to be practical, to be able to get done. Also, it has to be practical. And sometimes, all of us people that deal with infectious diseases at the hospitals and stuff like that, we're fortunate. It's a little bit easier for us and stuff with having a lot of staff. But I think also a good thing to keep in mind, especially with the new horses, just kind of try and not, take care of that horse last, just try and have just a group of people handling that horse and maybe not handling the rest of the population that's been there for a while. And again, you have to figure out what works best, what's the most practical in your situation. Those are just, I guess, a couple other things that I could throw out there.
So I actually also just bought a bunch of corral panels. So I have 6-foot high corral panels. That way I can create as many small turnouts if I need to, if there's horses coming in. Actually, my race filly just came home today. She's bred on our farm, raised on the farm. She still isn't getting turned out with the other horses, even though she's coming from a known facility. She's my horse until she's been in a couple days, just from a mental perspective, till she settles. And I know I'm not getting any turnout issues, but also just from a standpoint of, I don't know what she could have, who she could have interacted with or the trailer she was on, potentially something comes through. So even though I have all of her records, I'm still using corral panels as a way to kind of let her still get outside. So mentally she gets she still gets turnout, but she's not out in a large space. I know most of the farms here, when they do turnout, it's very paddock, little larger, and then a group. And I think that's, for me, like, I'm always thinking of how am I getting them outside as soon as possible.
I think one other thing, and this is a good point, even if in a different scenario, even if this horse would have come with all this history, it's been vaccinated, it's had this, it's had that, like 5 pages of history, it's still a new horse to your facility. You still need to, in my opinion, kind of quarantine as that horse, or isolate that horse as best you can for 14 days, because, you don't know where that horse had been and what horse that had been in contact with, what other horses it had shipped with, those different things, just to do what's best for, for your resident horses.
And I think just to touch on that as well, with the coming from a known facility, it can also be a bit like a kid coming back from daycare for the first time. And though nothing is catastrophically wrong, that is a lot of different germs and different things being brought into the environment. And as much as that can be contained is also, obviously preferable. So just a couple of things that we would consider in this scenario as you look at how you all responded. Where did you decide to place the horse? Stalls, turnout, how separate is that? What protocols do you have? Do you begin turnout immediately? Are you monitoring health? Are we taking the temps? Visual inspections, is that being recorded? Do you have a plan to vaccinate? As they touched on, it's not necessarily something that you want to do immediately. You want to make sure the horse is otherwise healthy, has had a chance to settle in before you get them caught up on a vaccination plan, assuming that none of the phone calls to the trainer got you any more information. And what are your handling protocols? Do you have staff designated to be on the new horses that are in a separate area? Are they turned out last so that you can more easily wash hands, change boots, whatever you may need to do, and whatever's most practical with your facility? So 2 days after arrival, you notice that the horse has nasal discharge. If you had been monitoring the temperature daily, you would notice that they had begun to show an elevated temperature 24 hours prior to the nasal discharge. At this point, what would you do? Everybody can write down what they would do if it's a multi-step, whatever your next steps would be, and then we'll come around and get your responses. Okay. Well, my guess is that it's right.
Check, check, check.
All right, has everyone's had a chance to kind of think about what they would do? Does anyone want to share what their protocol would be? All right, Kirsten is on her way with a mic, because we appreciate you guys using the mic, even though we can shout because we are live streaming as well. So there are some participants from further away.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Can you hear that? Oh, sorry.
There you go.
I'd look at what kind of discharge it is, if it's clear or, looks infected. I'd look at the overall demeanor of the horse, its eyes, its brightness, if it's eating and drinking, what its manure and looks like, how hydrated it is, if it's coughing, if its lungs are clear, if it's just a simple head cold or something worse, and obviously the temperature. Yeah, just it could be anything.
Anyone else want to chime in with anyone have anything they would do differently?
We would call the vet and get a PCR test.
Oh, hang on.
We would call our vet and get a PCR test done.
PCR test for what?
What do you think it could be?
We normally test for strangles if it's in thicker discharge.
It would be a
So-
PCR for strangles, okay.
So what diagnostic steps are taken, and would you change any handling or quarantine protocols that you had in place? So PCR test, obviously diagnostic step, that would be an option. And then, have you, prior to an answer being found or further diagnostics, are you adjusting any protocols in that moment?
No, I mean, I guess my comment, your comments are great. I mean, I guess, the important thing is, yes, this horse does have some nasal discharge. What does it look like? Is it clear? Is it purulent? What does it look like? The fever too, all those things are, in my mind, red flags. And I guess it just depends on, your comfort level. I definitely, think getting your veterinarian out there and getting a look at the horse, considering doing a PCR for strep equi, maybe waiting a couple more days just to, if you feel comfortable enough about your quarantine that, okay, I have this horse quarantine off. I feel comfortable with my protocols. I'll maybe wait another couple of days and see if this morphs into something worse, see if there's any more clinical signs, symptoms. I think those are good approaches but I think once again, the red flag should be going up. This horse, there could be something bad going on.
I have a quick question. I know the AAP has the Equine Disease Communication Center, EDCC, and they have that app, and it's supposed to give you kind of the updates of communicable diseases in every state, every county. Is that a reliable resource? Like if you have a horse that starts showing symptoms, to look on there as well and see, did this horse come in from a place that has a reported disease outbreak?
It is reliable. Yes. I mean, I guess you could look on there. They usually will say, if it's a track or some public facility, I do think they'll say the name of that facility. So, if the horse shipped from, Churchill Downs, not that I want to say it, but if horse shipped from Churchill Downs and Churchill Downs pops up on there as having a, some type of outbreak, that would be, you should really be jumping up and down saying, okay, we have a huge problem here. So it is a good resource. And yes, it is very accurate. But if it says, there was a strangles outbreak in Lexington, Kentucky, I think that then you're probably going to have to get on the phone. You could get on the phone and just call and just try and see if you could find out exactly where that horse came from. The other thing is these horses ship on, the commercial vans. So you never know where, all the horses on the van could have been coming from.
And I would just add, for the EDCC, some states report a lot more than others. And then there are also a lot of great resources on the EDCC's website about biosecurity and the specific diseases. Did have a question for you, just to kind of continue that scenario. What if you did not have your horse in a quarantine stall and now it's got the nasal discharge? What's, is it better to move it or leave it? And what's the
so you can answer, what would you do in that moment?
So if that horse was not in a quarantine stall, would you move? I mean, I guess I would probably if you have the room to move it, I would get it out of that barn. I would put it somewhere else. But knowing though that the horses that it was around were probably exposed, whether it was, if it's something aerosolized or nose to nose, or even with people, handling the horses. That's what I would do. I know sometimes that's not realistic. And then if that's the case, you cannot do that, then I probably would leave the horse where it is. Or if it is in a barn, you might be able to move it to like an end stall and maybe try and keep some stall space in between it and some of the other horses. The idea is, that's your kind of your the what do they call them? Anyways, that's your lead-in horse that has the problem, and trying to minimize the exposure of the ones that have already been exposed.
Okay, so now we're the next day, the horse has developed swollen mandibular lymph nodes, which now rupture. So we have a few more symptoms. What would you do at this point? If your diagnostic protocols would have already likely led to something, you can kind of skip this. So what would you do based on what you had done up to this point? Was the horse with other horses? Are you having to move it? Was it already quarantined? What would your next steps be? So take a few minutes. But I also wonder how much of them. I know at least a few people who suffer. Okay, so at this point, I think most of us relatively have an idea of where this would be going, depending on which diagnostic steps you choose, whether it's a culture of the abscess or you had already done a nasal PCR. It is strangles. So you now have a horse that has been in your facility for 3 days, in whatever quarantine or lack thereof that you would have had, whatever turnout, you now have diagnosed with strangles. Given the time frame, the horse came in with it, likely got it on the van prior to coming to you. So what would you do now that you have a confirmed diagnosis on your farm? Take a few minutes and think about how you would handle that with the confirmation.
But like, can I fit mean, my narrative comes, I was the one that was positive.
Okay, everybody's had a chance. We'll have a couple people share what their protocols would be and how they would handle this situation.
Well, we actually did earlier this year. It was super fun. So we had a horse come in. The irony was the only symptom that he showed was an elevated temperature, and that was it. And after a week of that temperature not going down after some basic treatment, that's when we had our vet out and they scoped him and found that he did have strangles. So at that point, we divided our barn into 3 different colors or zones of red, blue, or red, orange, and green for our highest risk horses that were right next to him, or maybe were turned out, kind of our step down, slightly lower risk, and then should be okay, but still want to keep an eye on. At that point, we did turn out most of the horses outside on one half of the farm, staying in those little zones so that they could quarantine outside. We did have 3 horses, including the strangles positive horse in the barn, but they were spaced out. We made sure that all of the tools were sanitized. And honestly, we didn't actually use those tools for all multiple of the horses. It was, 1 pitchfork for each horse. Our lovely trainer had to go out and Tempa everybody twice a day. She did bleach and do the entire disinfectant of herself between each horse as well. And we were very, very lucky where it was only 1 horse that was positive, and that was the only horse that did stay affected that entire time. So I would like to think that we did a pretty good job quarantine then.
Anybody with
doc-
anything to add on this side? Sorry.
Oh, no, I was gonna say Dr. Barr can chime in after, I would say, well, if you want to chime in of, did they do a good job?
No, that was a great job. I mean, the fact that only that horse was the only one that came up positive, that was great. Did you guys do any more diagnostics on any of the other horses, the higher risk horses, or not?
We kept them quarantined, but then in order to clear quarantine, they were all tested twice. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. No, I mean, that sounds great. Yes. With the different color zones, and that's making it simple so that, it's easier for your employees to be able to understand red's this, orange, whatever, so that's great. I mean, I think that's great.
And the reason we didn't PCR test him at the very beginning is he had no discharge. And they did run blood tests on him to try to figure out, that's what our vet had recommended. So we did change our protocol now where if there's any high temps to that extent, that we would include the blood and the PCR test just to be sure. The horse never swelled. He never had any of this, the symptoms that you normally have. They had to scope him, and it was only when they scoped him in his guttural pouches that they saw the infection. So that it was a very strange case from start to finish. And it's not our first time, like our other farms, we've had it before. And we've been really lucky to keep it to 1 to 2 horses. But this one, because we didn't know what it was for like until it was a little bit late, I was shocked that nobody else got it.
Very fortunate.
So we don't really have strangles in Puerto Rico. We did, I think the last case I saw was about 10 years ago. And it was a huge breakout, but since then we really haven't had too much. We find it really hard to get vets out also because we don't have enough. So usually if I've got a horse that's showing any symptoms or anything, draw blood right away, run it into the clinic at the racetrack. And we do have an area, there's an abandoned house at the entrance of our farm that has a backyard fenced in. So if any horses that needed to be separated, that we put them up there, and then we fully fumigate the area after and disinfect it.
I mean, that's great. I mean, like each scenario, each place is going to be a little different with what they can do.
The other thing that we also talked about adding to this was that contacting the shipper to let them know about it and the original source. So the communication part of that of saying, hey, by the way, the horse you shipped me, you might want to go back and do some contact tracing, and hey, person who sent it to me, by the way, take care of this. So that was the only thing we had was communication plan.
A lot of the instances, especially when it strangles, the state veterinarian's going to be involved, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be working on that too.
I think pretty much you guys touch on all of these things, but what quarantine protocols, and that's very much a conversation that your vet should be involved in, because you have to look at what is practical for your area, what is feasible, what you can do. Quarantine doesn't necessarily mean they're inside. Sometimes that's separating with different parts of the farm, whatever needs to happen, making sure your staff understands it, that proper disinfectants are being used and are being used properly, understanding how often a foot dip needs to be changed out and things like that. Making sure that you are using something appropriate for whether it strangles or something else, disinfecting your surfaces and for the bacteria or virus in question. And then, as Dr. Barr touched on, who is notified of the diagnosis, right? If you're talking about something that needs to be reported to the state vet, has that been reported? Getting back to the shipping company where your horse came from. For facilities that have horses coming in and out, did any horses get sold or adopted that were in that time frame that also could have been in contact in that window before you knew? Are you going to have to follow those points of contact as well to make sure that anybody who has a horse that was potentially exposed is aware of their elevated risk? And so then, based on what steps were taken, then you may be in a situation where your facility is shut down, you're in a full quarantine, or you might have just the one and you have a lot of temps and you go through a lot of disinfectant and then it's over. So this is a scenario where, depending on how things played out for you and what choices were made in the beginning and how quickly you caught it, gives you a way to stay well ahead of the issue. So just kind of to wrap up this scenario, would you consider your current intake protocols to be sufficient for handling a contagious disease outbreak? Do you think that based on the way something like this would have played out, would you have caught it in time, or would it have been a week before anything had happened and the horse had been exposed to everyone on your farm? Are you able to enact appropriate security measures, or is there something that you could do or modify? Like Kelly said, there's maybe there's a spot that you don't use unless it's for that because it's nice and it's separate. Maybe it's not the ideal turnout spot, but it works for quarantine. And is everyone that's handling the horses aware of what they should be looking for? like was touched on, is it clear discharge? Is it a low fever? Is it high? Is the horse not eating? Sometimes you may only have one indicator that something is wrong for a while or at all until it gets to a third horse. And then that's the one that gets much more sick. So the more things that everybody is monitoring and communicating, obviously the better situation you're going to be in. So if anyone has any other kind of questions about this scenario or the biosecurity stuff in general, if you want to throw up a hand and we can bring a mic, if there's any other questions on this scenario before we move on to the next. Nothing on the live stream. Okay. So we will move on to our next scenario. You are out doing afternoon feeding on your farm and you notice a significant amount of smoke coming from a storage barn. You call the fire department, who quickly arrive and are working to contain the fire. There are fire trucks and emergency vehicles in your barn, parking area, driveway. One route off of the farm is blocked. What are your first steps? And this is the farm map that is on your tables. That is the farm that you are working off of so that we can all be working through the same scenario. So you notice that barn, that storage barn labeled on kind of the middle of that map. Significant smoke, fire department is there. What do you do? This is mid-afternoon. Where are your horses? Where are your staff? Take a few minutes. All right, everyone's had a chance to kind of look at what you would do in this moment. So does anyone want to share what their first course of action would be based on, you know, where your horses would be as you would run this facility? Gonna volunteer you guys because you're the closest. I say.
Me? Okay. So looking at the map, what I would do is if there was any horses in the barn, the main barn, remove them from the main barn and just sit still and let in the field, if there's anybody, if there is an open field, put them in the open field and sit still and let them put out the fire.
Anyone on the other side, anything you would do other than moving the horses out of your, any horses in the main barn moving out? Is there anything different or additional that anyone would do on that side? So based on the layout, where are you moving the horses to? I think we touched on open turnout. Something to consider is in that situation, if there was some amount of horses in each field, are you willing to just throw everybody out together? Are there any people on the premises and that need to be evacuated or moved? Do you have any additional volunteers or staff that you could call to quickly come help move the horses? Do you have, this one would be more of on your own facility, but if that building is near the edge of your property, do you need to call a neighbor to let them know of a risk that they have as well? And is there anything in the path of the fire that can be moved other than your horses? And where are your combustibles? So do you have a diesel tank that's next to that barn you need to be worried about? Do you have a tractor that can be driven somewhere else? In addition to obviously everyone's first concern is the horses, our next thought is what else can be moved or needs to be moved and who needs to know about it. So if the fire spreads to your tree line that you see and to your main barn, so have you moved the horses far enough away? And is there anything that would have been stored in that vicinity that you need to be aware of? So just some things to consider. Do they need to move further? So if you opted to turn the horses out into, say, the arena next to the main barn, are they now too close to the fire? Do you have the ability to remove the horses from the property if your fencing were to be entirely compromised? How did you get the horses out of the barn? Were they safely led? Did you have to release them onto your farm? And do you have all humans accounted for? If you were to have to fully evacuate, do your staff and volunteers know of a spot to meet or a point of contact to make sure that you can verify everybody is okay? So the fire is contained by late evening and completely extinguished by midnight. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles depart. Your barn is significantly damaged. You can tell the structure is probably not salvageable. What do you need to deal with that night in that moment with your horses and things like that prior to the next day? So if you want to take a minute and write through that. All right, so does anyone want to share what their night of procedure protocol would be?
I'll take it anyway. That's okay. We just said, make sure that the outside horses, if they're, we're assuming there's grass in those pastures and they haven't been completely eaten down. They have grass and that they have water. If there's no water, figure out a way to make sure they have water for the night, make sure the fences aren't compromised, and go to the grain store in the morning. That was kind of, maybe get some on social media was part of the other thing of like, we might need hay, because I'm assuming everything got burnt in our barns. So start getting that going sooner than later, but let's just really make sure that they're all have water and some sort of forage for the night.
This is not pertaining to my facility, but back in 2018 in California, in Southern California, we had a very, very bad fire at one of our training facilities, San Luis Rey, and they lost 46 horses. It was like a massive windstorm fire. Is just really very tragic, and they transferred the horses over to Del Mar. And I mean, it was a massive effort from the community to volunteer and bring things, you know, all the tack and everything was lost, you know, from the trainers. And we just had a wonderful effort by people in the community that donated. And the horses, you know, came to Del Mar, and, you know, some were just in terrible shape. You can see their burns. So it's just, nothing really could have been done there. It was just engulfed, and it was just a sad situation for us in California.
And to that point, you know, there's things with biosecurity, it's a lot of prevention, and with some of these natural disaster type things, there's just nothing you can do when things come from outside of your control. And so that's looking at, you know, once you're in that moment, how can you be as prepared as possible for, you know, a situation that ultimately, you know, will in some way catch you unprepared.
Unfortunately, we have too many examples like that where we are. Some basic things like not related to racing, but we had another barn where they locked the horses inside the stalls at night and they didn't have keys and they lost that entire barn. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. So don't do that. And when you let a horse free, shut the door behind it so it can't go back to its stall.
So that's a very good point on the shutting the door behind so they can't run back in.
That happened in Hurricane Maria. There were so many horses that were locked in stalls and in the barns. We had to go through with crowbars and break the locks. I mean, I had to climb over fences, and some of those horses we couldn't get out. So we were just like giving them what water we could get out of the pipes that were still had water in them and stuff. But and the guys at our racetrack, they still won't learn. They did it again for this time. And I said to the security lady, I said, you know, when you're going through the barns checking, try and give these guys the orientation. You know, at least if you're going to lock the outside barn, fine, but don't lock the barn, the stall doors, because it just makes it so much more difficult to get them out if you need to. So that was a good point. You said that about the locks.
So looking at the scenario, if you had no power to the property due to where the fire was, you know, what needs to happen before morning? Do you have a backup power source that you can use? Because, you know, do you have well water? Do you need electricity for whatever your water source may be, to the point of having to figure something else out? You know, I know you touched on having a water source on your property. So is there a pond that you can pull water from, things like that to be aware of? Do you have electric fencing? Or is it secondary to your regular fencing? Is your fencing sufficiently intact? Who would you need to notify immediately? Things like insurance agents, your staff who's supposed to come in the morning, all things to consider, as well as what can wait until morning. Where have you evacuated the horses to and can they stay? So is there sufficient water, fencing? Did you opt to van them to a neighbor's farm and are they good to stay there? And then as you are checking to make sure that they have food and water, how are you handling if there's any vet care that needs to happen that night? If any of the horses are exhibiting any signs of stress, anything from the fire or from being out in an unfamiliar group, anything like that. If you're unable to go into your barn, is there anywhere else that things like first aid supplies are stored? Do you have access to an on-call veterinarian? All things to consider that night. Then looking ahead, it's the next day, you're able to fully assess everything. What would you be addressing that next morning when you come back out? Take a few minutes to work through that one.
Wendy's down there too.
All right, so everyone's kind of had a chance to think through that. So any volunteers for next morning? What needs to be addressed? Oh, no, Kristen's got you.
Forgive me if I keep, this is actually something that I have a professional background in. In another life, I was an underwriter and broker for property insurance. And so what I suggest is that you don't wait until after. You need to look at your policy yesterday. You need to understand your declarations page. You need to understand your deductibles. You need to understand your exclusions. You need to take pictures of your real and personal property. You need to understand what the replacement cost is for your facility. And you may want to protect yourself by hiring an independent adjuster, depending on how much you feel you know. because otherwise you're gonna maybe not get as much as you're entitled to.
Those are very good points.
And have it all online and in a binder away from the barn.
Yes. So you guys all. Other things to touch on?
I were just kind of thinking the next day, reaching out to the community, asking if there's anybody that could help out. For, yeah, having a good cry, having that mental breakdown the next day when you can like fully process things, that's important. Just kind of, again, I think reaching out to the community, they had a barn in Louisville last year or 2 years ago at this point, where they reached out to the community the next day. They ended up getting temporary stalls put up within really another day or two, and had so much supplies donated. They ended up having too much stuff. So we are really, really blessed in Kentucky, at least, that we can very easily and reliably count on our neighbors to help us out.
So some of this was touched on. Where are your records maintained and backed up? So if you did lose your barn, not just your insurance records, but also your horse health records, any employee information, things like that, is that only in one spot? Tack, hay, feed, medications, all of those things that we use. Where can you get them quickly? To the point of, I know if you're surrounded by farms, we're in a fortunate situation to generally be able to at least call on a neighbor to get through your next day or two. Where would your equipment have been in this scenario? You know, would you have lost a tractor, a mower, anything like that? And then what does your insurance cover? You've got your buildings and your fencing. If there was property damage to those trees, your equipment, the injury, any potential injuries to horses, but also the contents of those buildings. You've got hay, feed, tack, all of these things that may have been stored in there. Are those covered on your insurance? Do you have any sort of policy that covers, gives you any sort of cushion in the situation that maybe all of those things were lost? And then again, where are the horses? How long can they stay there? If you've evacuated horses to another facility, the next day is a point where you can start to go, okay, how long is it going to take to put up new fencing or temporary stalls, whatever it may be, and making that sort of longer term plan. So meant to give you a minute to look at the property to see if there are any problems you would have identified. Is there anything that you think is good about the layout of it, or anything that you think back on your own property that maybe could be adjusted to better handle a situation like this? You know, for example, if you were running through and opening stall doors, how perimeter fenced or contained is your property? If you had to let a horse loose from the barn, how far is it going to get in a good or bad way? And then have you spoken to your local fire department to ensure that they know where the barns are, how to get to them? They're aware of how many buildings there are. They're aware of anything like a combustible, your diesel tank, something like that, and natural water sources. I know here in Kentucky, the fire department will come out and they will mark down and say, okay, there's a pond that we can access to pull water in the event of a fire, things like that, to make sure that not only you know what your plan is, but your local emergency response does as well.
This one that's going for me, I'm going to be potentially hosting events next year, and that means that people, if emergency responders need one, and someone brought this to my attention, so I just thought I'd share. Actually, I plan to have my fire department and EMTs out in the spring to teach them horse handling for free, just a single afternoon, because they show up, they might not know how to grab a horse, like they might not feel comfortable. Not everyone in a fire department in that scenario would actually feel comfortable going up, or in just even a loose horse, if there's something that they're dealing with. Is everyone that's coming as a responder in your area for your local department, obviously. So I'm planning on doing that in the spring, just welcoming them out to the farm, making sure they're comfortable with the layout of the property, and also that they're aware of, hey, here's how to put a halter on a horse or grab a horse, or things that they might not want in a stressful situation. That might not be the right person, but at least they feel a little more equipped. So the tip someone gave me that I thought I'd pass along.
A couple years ago for a local fire department. And yeah, we actually, took them to the clinic and showed them how to put halters on the horses. And we actually had one of the firemen in his whole gear, because we didn't know how the horse would react. So yeah, that is a very good thing to consider doing.
And I think especially in areas with a lot of horses, we can take for granted that everybody knows certain things, but that's not necessarily true. All right, does anyone have any other questions or comments on that scenario? Good.
I know TCA was very instrumental in mobilizing disaster relief for the San Luis Rey fires. Erin, do you have anything that you can contribute, scenarios that you guys saw a lot of, that sort of thing?
Sure. Yeah. So TCA, we manage what's called the Horses First Fund, and it's essentially a disaster relief fund for natural disasters, large scale neglect cases, things like that. And we were able to activate the fund both for Hurricane Maria as well as the fires, the terrible fires at San Luis Rey Downs. And I think every scenario is completely different. Like there's no one that's ever been the same. But I think one of the things, that overarching things I've learned the most in working some of these disasters is it's not a solo effort. Like you've got to reach out to your community, like you all mentioned. It's a team effort. Like even the aid we were able to mobilize for Hurricane Maria. I mean, we had agencies working with us that I had never heard of before, and it just I think it really behooves you to reach out to as many people as you possibly can in those scenarios. I know you're doing a million different things at that point, but the group, the team effort that comes out of these is really was pretty surprising to me. But yeah, I think, again, you can plan for every worst case scenario out there, but until you're in it, there's things that just come up and you're like, really, how could that even happen? So yeah, we plan, as best we can, but that's really all we can do because things just come up that you never would expect.
All right, and that brings us to our third and final scenario. So this is a institutional shakeup. Your barn manager or program manager, executive director, whatever kind of very key head person that is applicable to your organization or farm unexpectedly gives their 2 weeks notice. To the commentary here, after what's happened at the farm, it's not surprising. They've decided to give their notice and they're leaving. What do you need to do? You have 2 weeks to be able to function without this key person. What are the first things that you need to do? Take a few minutes.
Contributions that wanted to invite. Oh yeah. To get out of my lane. Okay, so we've had key staff member, if that's your office manager, or maybe your equine manager, the person that is booking appointments to work with adopters to view horses, or the office manager that's doing your payroll and paying all your feed bills and that sort of thing. So they've given their 2 weeks, presumably on fairly good terms, right? There's no bad feelings. They're just going to go and do something else. So what does that mean for you? Who needs to be notified of the upcoming staff change? You know, generally you don't need to make like a big, Sarah's leaving, bye, like big announcement on Facebook, but who does that impact within your organization? Like, how is that the other staff members' workload going to change as you carry, you know, potentially, hopefully for a fairly short period of time, being short-staffed? Does this staff member own your property? We see this a lot, like in aftercare, like nonprofit organizations where you've got like a board member or staff member who has like started the organization on their facility, on their property. What does that mean for you? Like, are there terms to that written down and agreed upon someplace? What happens? If the staff member had equine care training duties, what duties need to be covered? Riding, feed, stall cleaning, holding for the vet or farrier, client appointments, trial rides. Do you have enough other people on your staff or within your volunteer base that can pick up on that? And if they were an administrative staff member, what did the staff member have access to? Bank accounts, bookkeeping, social media, client, adopter, donor records, personnel records, payroll, the website, the back end of your website, that sort of thing. How does that change things for you? So things to consider, you know, kind of HR terms, like we have onboarding, right? All of the things that we need to do to start an employee. Do you have an offboarding checklist? What does it mean when somebody leaves our organization is kind of what we want you to be thinking about. And do you have an offboarding situation or checklist for the best of circumstances? And do you have an offboarding protocol, like if you lose somebody abruptly? So that's the next part of this. So despite giving 2 weeks notice, the employee loses their temper several days later, walks off the job midday, and will not return phone calls or attempts to contact them. They're mad, it's drama. Stacy was mean, I couldn't take it anymore, like that sort of thing. So if you've got an abrupt situation where you can't contact this key person to get the information that you need to carry on operations, what does your protocol look like then?
And for this, because I know that those specific people are going to be different depending on what your organization looks like, we've put kind of what, if it was equine staff, your scenario, you have clients coming to look at horses, the staff member is the person who'd been working with the horses, and your buyers what do you need to do to make that happen? Do you even know that it's going to happen, or are you going to have people show up the next day? If this person in your organization is someone on the administrative side, tomorrow's payroll is due. They were the person that ran it. They were on the bank account. How can you make sure that your staff continue to get paid? So depending which it is for your organization, take a minute and think about how that would play out for you. All right, so you kind of had a minute to think about how that would be handled. Does anybody want to share if that person in their organization would have been equine or administrative, and then how would they have handled that situation?
So I want to say something. It's to do with this. Recently, I was at the Racehorse Summit in Colorado, which I think there are a few people here who were there. And when they were talking about the business plan of your mission and your board members, it opened my eyes because if anything ever happened to me, nobody would know what to do with my organization. So I went back home to Puerto Rico and I made a binder with all of our local Puerto Rico nonprofit papers, government papers, all of our IRS 501c3 papers, our job descriptions for each employee. I got them all to get them signed. My job description, and I mean, everything, the bank information, because it never really occurred to me that if something did happen to me, nobody knows like all the ins and outs of CTA. And the other thing is each one of these things has happened to me. I recently had one of our employees, the Monday that I got back from Colorado, he just texted and said he quit, and he'd been with me for a year, and he was the only full-time employee we had. So he was feeding the horses, cleaning the stalls, you know, doing the hard work, and the only person I had in the afternoon. So basically, every time an employee of ours leaves, I have to fill in. And as many of us running a 501c3, we wear many hats and have to do a lot of things. So that was just something that may be a good idea for anybody that doesn't have that, is to prepare a binder with all of your information. So if you did end up leaving or something, somebody else wouldn't know what to do.
I just have to say gold star that you did all of the nonprofit paperwork and that sort of thing, the things that you need all the time to apply for grants and keep money coming in. You need copies of all those certificates and stuff like that. And so it's so great that you filed all of that.
And the other thing, having Dawn sitting here, Shelly, who's co-founder of CTA, who is no longer with us, she's still on the board, but she's not really involved anymore. She used to do all of our grant writing. So after the finish line has like a protocol of how they want their grants done. So when I started doing our grant writing for after the finish line, it was a nightmare. Poor Dawn was getting so frustrated with me because Shelly was so organized with it. And like what you're saying about the grants, like everybody likes to do everything a different way, like all the organizations want their grants differently. So that's another thing you have to, you know, make sure that everything, we're using a new platform now called HubSpot, which all of our, like, we have different files for after the finish line grants, TCA grants, TAA accreditation, the Racehorse, and little by little, I'm putting everything in each file so that if somebody new comes in, I can say, okay, so all the paperwork you need for this organization's here, and just to try and make it more organized, because I think what happens is when organizations like mine, which we, like I said before, wear many hats, you can kind of forget about these important issues, important paperwork, and to be organized, because you always just think you're going to be there. In 2020, I resigned from CTA and I said, I'm done. I'm not going to do this anymore. And so CTA was going to close down because we could not find anybody to take it over. And so of course I didn't leave, because I'm not, I'm not going to leave like 3,000 horses stranded on an island. But yeah, I mean, these are just things you need to talk with your board members about and see really who's on board and get everything really organized and written down in paper.
Yeah, those grants, I mean, Aaron obviously handles all of the grant applications for Thoroughbred Charities of America. And that's just a really good example of a thing that is a big administrative project that has deadlines, often follow-up reports, benchmarking, turning in budgets, things like that. And if you don't have somebody up to speed on those processes, trying to like reverse engineer that and put that together really jeopardizes missing some of those critical deadlines and possibly jeopardizing your funding. So
Yeah,
you have some.
absolutely. And kudos to you, Kelly, for doing that. I had an old boss. She was wonderful, but she would always tell me, Erin, if you get hit by the beer truck, I need to know what to do next. I'm like, well, can we say maybe if I win the lottery? But her point was, there's so much knowledge that we all keep up here. And if we do get hit by the beer truck or win the lottery, whatever, we have to have it written down somewhere. And we're all guilty. I'm guilty of it, at TCA. And especially I think the smaller the organization, the more, of a challenge it becomes to take that time to write it down, and then things change and maybe it doesn't get updated. But I think either having like an operations manual, or I know at TCA we have a board manual, and it's all of the pertinent papers that when you become a board member, you get this digital board manual. So I don't know if they read it or not, but at least they have it. But I think the point again is just, not having one person be the keeper of all of that information.
And I think you touched on something important to remember as we, kind of think through this, but what if it is you? What if you're the person that leaves? Because I think it's also very easy to fall into, well, I can do both those things, so it'd be fine. And while that may be true, what if you are the person who, for reasons good or bad, is no longer working for the organization, running it, able to be of assistance? And so, yeah, making sure that nothing lives only in your brain, or that if the answer to all of these questions of how would you address this is I would do it, that might also indicate that additional backups need to happen.
I have a couple of wrap up points, but were there any other thoughts that came up on this side of the room, scenarios that you've lived through?
Me again. There are so many flavors of 501c3s, and it depends on whether or not you have staff at all, whether or not it's paid or not, how big your board is, and what flavor your board is. Ideally, everybody wants a strategic board. That's not reality a lot of the time. It's still too operational. And I know that people struggle with that. Ideally, every organization needs to do a strategic plan as soon as possible and do a SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, so that stuff like that come out way before a scenario like this happens. Because things like this do come out, and also what comes out of this is an operations plan and internal controls policy. So all of these things are identified and addressed. You don't end up with a cult of personality where you have a bottleneck hit by a bus scenario and no way to continue.
Dawn, with after the finish line, have you anything that you could add to this?
I can say personally, I have in my trust, I have money going to aftercare organizations if I'm not here. I have like a paragraph talking about, my board members and what they need to do and give them information so that they can close down after the finish line if I wasn't here, because I don't think they want to take care of it. So, as far as a trust, I've worked that way, even with like some brood mares or horses that we own. I left money for them so that they have the money going throughout the years. But that's personally what I've done.
So just to wrap up some of the thoughts that we have here, we talked about, onboarding an employee versus offboarding an employee, and ideally leaving under the best of circumstances, but sometimes that's not the case. And how do we have a plan for that? So some of the ideas we've touched on here: keep a staff tree and job descriptions ready to go. If you have a vacancy, that will help you be able to quickly post that and start the hiring process. And we're talking about maintaining onboarding and offboarding checklists. And this talks a lot about access. In small nonprofit organizations, particularly paying for software or like web-based programs that we're using, paying for individual seats gets very costly. But the advantage of doing that sort of thing is controlling access. So if you're paying for, say, Dropbox, right? You're doing your best practices, you're saving all of your work files in Dropbox instead of locally on your computer or somebody's personal computer, which is good, again, for natural disasters, making sure you don't have loss of documents. But what happens when you're all sharing the same Dropbox password on multiple computers? How do you quickly make sure that you can remove somebody or revoke somebody's access from that if they leave the organization, particularly under bad terms? You can't do that quickly without disrupting other people. So think about that. And the same goes for social media accounts. We've seen it happen a couple of times in the last year or so, where really well-developed followings have just been completely lost because you had one person that was an admin on the account. They got hacked, and then there wasn't anybody else on the staff to help like restore access to the account. So situations like that, the back end of your website, that sort of thing. Are you set up with multiple people on your bank accounts, on your social media accounts that can help you manage access in situations like this? And like we touched about, all of your records, don't save them locally on machines, whether they are personal machines, whether they are work issued machines. Keep those things in a file sharing system like Google Drive, like Dropbox, and maintain those basic written procedures just to make sure that there's no interruption to administrative processes and that sort of thing, so that you can just keep on rolling. And then again, making sure that you have at least 2 to 3 trusted individuals, whether they are additional staff members, board members, that sort of thing, on your bank accounts, on your social media accounts, and that sort of thing. So I hope you all are sufficiently terrified of the world abroad, but I hope that you at least maybe thought about some things that you hadn't thought about so carefully, or came away with some good ideas. So definitely follow-up questions, final thoughts, anything like that, please flag me down.
And just to let you all know, everyone who had signed up on Eventbrite, we've got your email. So I will be sending out an email that'll have a link with some further resources, some of the things that were mentioned here, as well as a copy of Dr. Barr's slides, as well as kind of the stuff for you to have as a reference point, in addition to the wonderful notes that I'm sure you all took. So you will have some follow-up options with this stuff all coming back to you later after this event. But any questions while we're all here in front of you? Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope that you walked away with some action items and not too much terror pertaining to these scenarios. And like I said, we'll send out these follow-ups, and if there's any questions you guys think of later, or topics you wished we delved into, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.